All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Rachel Godum, and I am the Community Economic Development Director at Acadiana Planning Commission. And I have my colleague here, Kelia Bingham, who's the Watershed Coordinator for Louisiana Watershed Initiative Region 5, and Kate Jones, who's our tech man, but also does a plethora of things at the office. So thank you again for having us today. We're appreciative to come and do this outreach and engagement meeting with you all. And we also thought it would be a nice opportunity to ask the other soil and water conservation districts, which is who's going to probably end up joining us online, to participate in today's presentation, so we can get basically the word out about what has been going on with the Louisiana Watershed Initiative in the last 2 years, and then also what is the proposed path forward that has been, I guess, we've built a consensus around this recommendation that will be presented to you today among the 16 parishes that we serve and represent for Louisiana Watershed Initiative Region 5. And so a little bit about Acadiana Planning Commission, and I know some of you have heard the presentation, so just bear with us and provide additional feedback if needed today. But Acadiana Planning Commission is one of 8 planning districts throughout the state of Louisiana, and we were set up legislatively as a quasi-governmental agency of the state to do multi-jurisdictional planning efforts on behalf of economic development. We also facilitate the Metropolitan Planning Organization, which does large transportation projects on behalf of federal highways and also DOTD. So we often act as a liaison between federal and state government to do various projects within the region. Our original boundary was 7 parishes, but with the Louisiana Watershed Initiative, we have the capacity or ability as a governmental unit to expand our boundaries if needed to serve multiple parishes for specific projects and as funding and authority and roles and responsibilities permit. So we more recently, Acadiana Planning Commission has been facilitating this role on behalf of the Louisiana Watershed Initiative to coordinate the 16 parishes on governance recommendations, also on assisting in the deployment of a state, and you'll see a lot of this in the presentation today, but state river and rain gauge network. There's also a modeling effort, and there's a few other components and elements of the LWI. But really our committee, made up of our 16 parishes, and each of those parishes put forth a committee member to sit on this steering committee to help walk through and guide this process. And while we're doing this process here in Region 5, there's other regions across the state who are conducting this similar process. So the state of Louisiana as a whole is going through the process of outlining provisional governance recommendations and setting up some sort of future prospective governance moving forward in the future for watershed management purposes. Our region serves 5 major watersheds, and Keely will go over that, but the Atchafalaya, the Teche, the Vermilion, and then the Mermentau and Mermentau headwaters. And so other regions are also have multiple HUCs and are serving multiple parishes. I think we are one of the largest regions within the state, but we do have a loud voice when it comes to advocating for things at the state level. So we're appreciated to serve in this role and in this capacity. Acadiana Planning Commission is, and we appreciate the feedback that we hope to receive today and then moving forward in the future about how to refine our process, about how to be more inclusive if necessary, and just the feedback that is so critical to refining what our recommendation is to the state. So with that, I'll hand it over to Kelia to give us a 101 on LWI and then an overview of what we've been doing for the last 1.5 years on this governance recommendation. Thank you all.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you all for having us, and then thank you, Mitzi, for suggesting and including all the conservation districts within Region 5. So I really appreciate it. So I can give you an overview if you're not familiar with the Louisiana Watershed Initiative. Next slide. So, okay, the challenge. So we know flooding doesn't follow political boundaries. You've probably heard of this, right? This is this regional watershed management. So what we do in one parish can affect another, even across state lines. So the opportunity is to basically fundamentally change how we address flood risk reduction. So creating that watershed-based approach to floodplain management, which isn't an easy task, but if we keep doing what we've done before, nothing really changes. So we want to have this shift in policy, in our mindset, in behavior. So looking at watershed-based floodplain management. Obviously, you know what a watershed is. It's a place where water drains to. A large watershed contains other smaller watersheds and bound by natural ridges, and of course, those human elements in the landscape, which can be challenging in terms of flooding. So our steps towards regional watershed management. So the guiding principles for Louisiana Watershed Initiative, obviously we want to use scientific tools and principles that data-driven decision-making, objective decision-making, maximizing your natural floodplains, and also, again, emphasizing that term regional water management. So the Louisiana Watershed Initiative is managed by the Council on Watershed Management. These are the state agencies. So we have CPRA, the Governor's Office, Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, DOTD, and Louisiana Office of Community Development. That's where the funds from the Louisiana Watershed Initiative come from, which you'll see in another slide. So the Office of Community Development is where the LWI is housed. So we have a shared focus on resilience, right? It takes a village. So we need our continual input from our stakeholders and our experts, and that's why we're here today. So we have our technical advisory groups, we have our council on watershed management, and Rachel mentioned we have regional steering committees. You'll see in a little bit, we have 8 regions in the state. This is how the LWI divided us. And so each region has a steering committee. So we have 8 steering committees in Louisiana. So we kind of have the arrows going back and forth in this constant communication to make this change towards regional watershed management. So overview, Louisiana Watershed Initiative was established by the governor after the floods of 2016. Like I said earlier, the Council on Watershed Management oversees the $1.2 billion, which comes from HUD, the Federal Housing and Urban Development. So when flood mitigation was allocated to the state by HUD, again, through the Office of Community Development. So to improve water management, proactively, effectively address your flood risk and reduction and mitigation. And again, this holistic regional approach to flood management. So the coordinating agencies, so again, to the state is divided into 8 regions based on a HUC 8 watershed. These, again, the boundaries these are provisional boundaries provided by the state. They're defined by watershed, not geographic boundary. The coordinating agencies, Rachel said, the Acadiana Planning Commission here in Region 5 is the fiscal agent. Other regions mostly are managed by planning commissions. We have a couple of police juries that are overseeing this regional process for Louisiana. Next slide, thank you. So we have $1.2 billion. So this is just a general kind of breakdown. The LWI has a state action plan, which is a long document, but it further breaks down the budget. So overall, we're looking at our local regional projects and programs, state watershed projects and programs. I'll go over that in a bit. Again, our watershed monitoring, mapping, and modeling, cost share assistance, administrative costs, and that policy planning and that local capacity assistance. So this is basically how the $1.2 billion is going to be spent. Next slide. So this one of those line items is state projects and programs. So we're in phase 1, and there was a press release on March 23rd. Phase 1 includes 163 million flood risk reduction, drainage, and critical infrastructure projects. So the press release on March 23rd had an award announcement. The contracts are in development with the applicants to the projects. Again, this is state. So these are state agencies, their programs. This is the first phase 1 of this funding. And there was 15 projects total in the state, and 5 of those 15 projects are within Region 5. So we have about $44 million of flood reduction projects coming to our region, which is good news. So then we have another line item is your local and regional budget for projects. So we're in round 1 phase. This is low risk projects, high impact that mitigate flood risk and encourage the prioritization of projects, again, through that regional collaboration. So this is the first round we're going to be going through, and I'll give you a breakdown of the timeline that each region will be receiving funds for. So that round 1, there's a lot of phase 1s and round 1s. So round 1 for your regional projects is $100 million total. for round one. So 60 million, that's the state projects. Well, the 60 million, it's selected by the state, but it's going to be regionally implemented. And we should get those projects announcements, who the state selected at the end of May. So again, the state selected, but will be implemented in the region. And the other 40 million, that's going to be divided by our 8 regions. So 8 regions going to get $5 million for a local and regional project. And that will be selected by the region. So each region has prioritized what they want with the values for their region, coming up with, we're coming up with our own technical scoring and criteria. Some are using the states. So once the state gives us the projects that they funded, we'll have a sort of leftover list, and we can look at those projects and decide what can be funded by the regional steering committees. Again, it's only $5 million. If we could get one project, it's not a lot, but I think this is sort of like a pilot project for the regions to go through each of this process, and that's going to evolve. But we're excited by that. We're going to select those projects, submit those projects in July, and the award should come in September from the state. So we have a program timeline. This kind of started in 2019. Looking at the last 2 lines, like I said, the award announcements for the 60 million in statewide projects that'll come at the end of this month. And then the recommendation for the regional projects we'll give about in the summer for July, and those awards should be announced about September or so. So far the applications for round 1 that state received, they were processing 190 applications. So it's the first of multiple rounds of the funding that could be made available over a 12-year grant period. So there's 3 rounds of funding. First round was the 100 million for the regional projects. The second round, I think it's about 270 million. And the third round is like similar, 270 million as well. But this is like in 22 to 24. That's the timeline for now. So we have these funds will be dispersed. There's a timeline for that. Again, as we kind of refine our process, and as our hopefully our regional steering committees, the idea is that we'll be enabled by the state. That's why you're here today, to look at our governance provisional recommendation, to have this future watershed coalition that will be making those project decisions for the region in the future. Okay, so our regional capacity building grant program, that's what's funding us. So the state awarded $400,000 for each watershed region, basically to do what we're doing today. For our steering committees, today providing recommendations for long-term regional watershed management framework, building that regional staff capacity, and we want to produce a regional capital improvement inventory of our flood reduction projects as well. So we're in Region 5. We have 16 parishes. We are one of the largest regions in the state. Some parishes are in multiple regions. Again, it's not defined by geography. So Alexandria, they're in 4 different regions. So they have a lot on their plate, but they're handling it well for now. And so I guess the advantage of that is that you have that cooperation, looking at what the other regions are doing. But again, that's how we're going to hopefully solve this or mitigate flood risk and reduction. Next slide, please. Thank you. So now Rachel mentioned earlier, so our 5 watersheds of study within Region 5, we have the Tesh, the Vermilion, Mermentau headwaters, and parts of the Atchafalaya Basin. We have slivers of Point Capee and Iberville Parish. Those areas weren't really heavily populated, but that's where the Atchafalaya Basin comes in. So that is part of Region 5. Again, we have steering committees. Each region has a steering committee. We have 16 parishes, so each parish appointed a member to represent that parish for a steering committee. We have 3 community appointments, which are ex officio, so they're non-voting members, but their input is very needed, and we appreciate them serving on our steering committee. We had originally 3 subcommittees. A governance and long-term sustainability, which you'll see in a little while, is where our provisional governance recommendation came from, and that was voted on by the steering committee. We have a capital improvement program. That's what we're developing, that project criteria and scoring evaluation. Then we did have a CRS floodplain management program. The CRS is the community rating system for the National Flood Insurance Program. That has, we've dissolved that committee and it's evolved to have a regional CRS user group, which I'll speak about in a little bit. We just had a kickoff meeting, but we want to continue having that as a resource for our regions. So here we are, the provisional governance recommendation. So LWI is finalizing the phase where all regions have submitted their recommendation for long-term governance. The effort, we want to become more resilient overall as a state, and we want to rely less on that post-disaster mitigation for our watershed and drainage needs. So the region's entity, which is us, is tasked with vetting these recommendations locally, and we really appreciate your input. Next slide. So how did we get here? So we have our steering committee, and each steering committee went through exercises with the state. So we had the first governance exercise was, what is the work? What do we need to do? We know there's a problem, right? But we need to define that and look at a solution. Second governance exercise, who's going to do this work? And the third was how we're going to do it. So from November through January, we looked at a provisional recommendation for governance for, again, like a future watershed coalition. We're doing outreach engagement as January through April, probably extending that till June or July. And then we're going to refine those recommendations. And the goal is at the end of July that we'll submit our final governance recommendation to the Council on Watershed Management. Next slide. So the provisional regional recommendations, we want to focus on supporting that long-term regional watershed management activities, right? We're looking at roles and responsibilities. We're going to look at the authorities, the composition of the coalition, the facilitation, and how we're going to implement this. So we have 4 slides. These are highlights from our governance recommendation. Hopefully you signed in. Please make sure to sign in the sheet that's being passed around. Afterwards, I can email your survey. We appreciate your feedback. And also our website has like the long version of our governance recommendation. So we want to look at the existing conditions and proposed solutions. So anything we know there's a problem, but let's define it, go through it, and come up with some kind of strategy to fix it. So first one, we have a lack of identified watershed project priorities, our regional projects. So we want to develop a watershed and hazard mitigation plans to solve this. Also, 5 of the 72 communities that we have in Region 5 are participating in that community rating system. So that's a very small number. The community rating system is an incentive program from the National Flood Insurance Program. It gives you credit, and for anywhere from having pamphlets about flooding to, looking at your codes within the city or parish. And Lafayette recently, a really good resource is Stephanie Weeks. She's a floodplain manager for Lafayette Parish, although she's moving on as a regional CRS coordinator, so she'll still be a big help. But she helped elevate Lafayette Parish. And the idea is that when you get more points in the system for the CRS, you can save money on your flood insurance premiums. And that's when you really, if you could save $200 a year, I think that's pretty good. So we want to develop a regional community rating system strategy and best practice to address this. Also, tends to be inconsistent development standards, the impact of adverse development on real estate values insurance. Higher standards are perceived as a deterrent of economic development activities. If you have too much regulation, too much development codes, that this developer won't come and bring us that economy, within our parish, and it's going to go to another parish. So we don't. That's the perception anyway. So to kind of solve that, we want to promote our consistent watershed-based floodplain management policies, and for the state to set a minimum standards when it comes to flooding. Project modeling is typically confined to a political jurisdiction, and limitation of existing models that verify your true impacts of our projects. So what we want to do is adopt a regional watershed-based permitting process. Now we're using permitting. It could be some kind of a guide or agreement. We don't want to create an extra step. No one wants more permits, but something to maybe streamline that process that we can help move these projects along. Florida has these watershed management districts, and the Louisiana Watershed Initiative had a webinar on that They've been doing this sort of regional coordination since the 70s. So we're trying to look at, who's done this before and how we can learn from that and make it easier for what we're proposing. Next slide. Another condition we have is that parishes plan for projects after a disaster, right? It's always post-disaster. There's often dependent on your state and federal funds. So we have limited coordination occurs among the parishes within that HUC 8 watershed. That is the boundaries that's been defined by LWI right now. And there's limitations exist for ensuring that there's no adverse impacts on neighboring parishes. We don't want something that's, from Rapide sending all their water to Vermilion. So we want to coordinate with local entities to plan and fund regional projects, and our future watershed coalition will become a clearinghouse for those projects impacting the watershed. And I do have to say, Region 5 Steering Committee, we have representatives from each parish, and I see a lot of cooperation and concern as well. So whatever's happening in the north, we don't want that to adversely affect what's coming down to the south. So also another condition, we have limited resources and capacity and inhibit our rural areas from seeking external funding sources. So these same funding sources often do not contribute to operations and maintenance of existing projects. So funding's a problem, right? Maybe your smaller areas or rural areas. Also that long-term maintenance of operation maintenance of your projects. So we can find supplemental funding for projects and support to implement those projects. We're going to assist local jurisdictions in funding long-term O&M for those projects. That's also a goal of the Watershed Coalition. Another condition, we have minimal to no local funds that are generated for project planning and technical engineering assistance. So we might have a great projects come from this community, but they don't maybe have the funds to get that techno expertise. So a solution for the coalition would be providing technical and financial assistance to those local jurisdictions to develop project plans. Next slide. So we have a lack of regional watershed models to make that data-driven watershed management decisions. So workforce development, there's limited exposure to water science careers among young professionals. So how could we solve this? So a proposed solution, we want to have a local or regional, we're calling a decentralized model use, storage, and maintenance. So the state is doing that watershed modeling. And for each region has like a subcontractor. So we have HDR engineering that's working on the modeling for Region 5. We also have no local funding mechanism to support regional modeling scenarios, a model storage or future model calibrations as it exists now. So the coalition would financially sustain that model use, storage, and maintenance, and also make it publicly available. That would be a solution. We also, there's a need for improved water science tools, right, within our riverine and tributaries that enhance that future model calibration and continue and contribute to flooding alerts that generate that near to real-time data for emergency alert purposes. And that's kind of what we need. So we also have, this is not LWI funded, but we have the proposed Acadiana Regional Gauge Network, which are in the process of working with our parishes, and the UL Louisiana Watershed Flood Center. This is the Acadiana Planning Commission project that was funded by hazard mitigation funds. And so we would have that in our area. The state has a river and rain gauge network for the whole state. That's not tributary data, that's your riverine data, which is good. But they're doing about 100 gauges throughout the whole state. The Acadiana Regional Gauge Network, we're proposing just 100 sites. So we'd have more gauges in our 8 parish area for the Acadiana Regional Gauge Network than the whole state. So we have more data in our area, but a component of the Acadiana Regional Gauge Network was to promote that resiliency, to give you real-time data for flood alerts. And so we've consulted with each parish. We've had meetings with their technical experts. Maybe a gauge is needed here. We need a flow gauge here, so that someone might know, oh, Smith Road is flooding now, so I'm going to try to take an alternate route. And the idea is to maybe have something on your phone, like you get weather alerts from KLWI or KATC, but this would be for the rain gauge network. So that's what we're proposing. Next slide. Okay, so existing condition, we have a lack of knowledge about the National Flood Insurance Program, the community rating system. So we want to have a public awareness campaign to promote those best management practices to develop for development and that CRS participation. I think there's just a lot of things that are unknown. So again, if we can, as a coalition, help people know about that, what's available, they might participate better. And again, help with local flooding, looking at those practices that the CRS system, CRS community rating system recommends, but also a reduction on your flood insurance premiums. So we have limited resources and capacity dedicated to that participation. So we want to provide oversight and manage the CRS user group. Like I said, we had a kickoff meeting in April. We'll try to schedule another one in June, maybe do it bi-monthly for now. But we had good participation, and I think there's a great need for that. Other regions do have these CRS user groups, and they're very helpful. So we need that in our region. Also, we have 400 entities within LWI Region 5 that has some kind of level of water management responsibility. That's a lot. 16 parishes, 400 entities. There's little coordination exists for common goals for water management improvements. So that inter-parish coordination would improve that regional cooperation and advocate for regional needs. So we want to support and promote that inter and intra-parish collaboration with municipalities, our drainage districts, and other entities involved in the watershed for overall effective watershed management. So those 4 slides were the highlights of it, and it's a kind of lot to digest. But again, we have our subcommittees went through this, our steering committee. These are representatives for each parish that have identified this problem, and then we've identified the solution. The authorities of the coalition. So the recommended authorities would be to cooperate and contract with other government agencies, ability to generate revenue, which I'll talk about in a little bit, oversee that regional planning process, and perhaps that authority to issue permits as well. Next slide. So financial stability, right? Long-term financial sustainability. So we have recommendations of funding sources. We have user fees, stormwater fees, infrastructure banks, green bonds, carbon pricing, trading markets, property taxes, millage, and a sales tax. That's just some of your typical funding mechanisms. Other management strategies have also been identified. So we want to, again, that long-term sustainability of the coalition. You have to have a steady funding source, but then as well, you want to have additional and supplemental funding as well. Next slide. So this financial sustainability came about. Louisiana Watershed Initiative hired Stephen Piku. He is out of New Orleans with adaptation strategies, and he developed a white paper, strategies for funding watershed management. And the top recommendation from him was stormwater fees because it's most equitable, and those funds will go directly to the management of runoff. When you're managing that runoff, you're helping reduce flood risk. User fees, like funds paid to gain access to a service, groundwater extraction. We have a lot of water here in Louisiana, but it's still cheap. So that could be another way to generate some kind of revenue. They also recommended carbon pricing and trading market. I don't know if we do this here, but I've heard about it, reducing greenhouse gas emissions by passing the cost on to the emitter. There's also the trading market. So water users with high pollution reduction costs can purchase pollution reductions from sources with lower costs. DEQ kind of has this, they have a program, the water quality trading program, but it hasn't generated any money yet. So I don't know how that would work out in our region, but these are the top recommendations. Next slide. So our coalition, thank you, coalition composition and facilitation. So who's going to make up this coalition? So the Acadiana Planning Commission, it was recommended by the steering committee as we would be the agency and our staff of the Region 5 steering committee, and we'd be responsible for facilitation of all the meetings for the coalition and perform the administrative functions. Through cooperative agreements, the following work could also be performed on behalf of the district. So these, we'd have some type of cooperative agreement with the UL Louisiana Watershed Flood Center. They assist in the coalition that model use, storage, and maintenance, data analytics, your project modeling scenarios, and again, talking about that general water science needs. Also, we have the Tesh Freshwater District, and they would assist with coordination, operations, and maintenance of the gauge network, and again, general water quality efforts. So this was recommended by the steering committee of the composition of the coalition. Next slide, please. So again, going back to the slide you saw with the states divided into 8 watershed regions. there were boundaries, provisional boundaries the state provided based on that Huck 8 watershed. So we took the boundary, modified it a little bit, and also we suggested to have a management districts in that purple area and planning districts in that green yellow area. So the red areas are boundary, and we are split. Some parishes are split, and we had outreached and spoken with all these parishes. Calcasieu and Cameron still want to be a part of the region, but maybe in a planning capacity. Again, we have slivers of Iberville and Point Coupee, so they would still be part of decision making, but not necessarily management. And your management would probably tie into your funding. Those are the parishes that would be paying in to fund the coalition in some form of the financial sustainability that was recommended. Next slide. So the future Region 5 Watershed Coalition comprehensive study of regional watershed data. We want to utilize the state watershed model on a regional scale, recommend projects that incorporate that holistic regional approach and beneficial outcome. A regional coalition would be enabled and chartered by the state to generate your long-term sustainable local and alternate funding, plan to implement those projects for natural disasters, and develop response plans and have the indemnified authority implement said plans. So the steps is that once we have our final recommendation, the council approves that would be going into the state legislator for next 2022 legislative session so that we could be enabled by the state. Next slide. Like I said, we need your feedback. Your feedback is really important. After this is over later today, I can email you a link to the survey and our provisional governor's recommendation. Of course, if you have any questions, let us know. But having that feedback, is very crucial. That can help us further define the recommendation. Next slide. So the next steps. So in July, the staff will present our final governor's recommendations to the Council on Watershed Management. And from July 2021 to about May 2022, we're going to have that second phase of outreach. So we're going to update regional stakeholders and final recommendations and important LWI program updates for legislative strategy. So that's like the next step. And we can see what the next year entails. Next slide. That was kind of, again, a lot to digest. And if anyone has any questions or comments.
3 or 4 slides back,
yes.
You mentioned something about fees on groundwater.
Right.
I mean, I'm a rice farmer, and I have about 17 sources of water. I farm 6,000 acres, and of all those sources of water, half of them come from the ground. I can never support any kind of tax or fee or anything like that on any kind of groundwater tax. I mean, I don't see that as a fair or a equitable proposition. You're gonna have a hard time getting any support on that. A lot of what we do, especially in conjunction with NRCS, is trying to find ways to minimize the amount of groundwater that we're using to use more surface water.
Right.
A lot of our rice fields provide storage for water, unlike a lot of the other crops that are grown that just don't have any capacity to, there's no infrastructure there to hold water in.
Correct.
There's a lot of freeboard in a rice field or a crawfish pond that if the structures are set up right, they can maintain 3 or 4 extra inches of water that don't allow it to run out. So I think that maybe if you did focus some of your efforts maybe more on working with producers who already have some sort of infrastructure. I mean, basically a rice field or a crawfish pond is like a big retention pond.
Yes.
With a structure to hold a certain amount of water. So I think that if you maybe took a more approach maybe along those lines, because then you start to tag people and you're creating habitat for animals. You get more emotional ties and you get more support from the Fish and Wildlife or others, those guys can want to jump in and maybe help you gather some funds that way. But anything that talking about groundwater, that really that's the one thing that stuck out to me the most.
And that was the white paper. There's also a link there. It kind of goes into more of that. It didn't target agriculture, so that's a suggestion. So,
Oh, yeah, but if it targets industry, agriculture's next.
right, but this is the feedback that we need.
Yeah,
So,
and the funding solution is always the most challenging, right?
Exactly.
You say property tax, the people throw up their hands. You say sales tax, people throw up their hands. So at some point, we have to answer the critical question, well, what are the solutions and what is the funding mechanism to be able to sustain it? Because what we're doing now is not necessarily, I guess, doesn't provide us a lot of autonomy to do what we need to do. We're relying heavily on state and federal funds to plan for our waterways. And so we need to make that mental shift to look to how do we improve this moving forward in the future. A lot of these processes that are built in here and some of the recommendations that are being made are currently being done for transportation. Right now, there's funding coming from the federal government, annual appropriations through federal highways that filters as through DOGD, and DOGD funds federal and state roadways. Local roads, again, where do we find the funds? So that's going to be the big question: is how do we sustain this locally? If you're not implementing some sort of millage or sales use tax or even user fee, and I don't think there's going to be one funding solution. I think it's going to be a portfolio of all of possible funding solutions. And so that's why we need critical feedback like you're giving us today to better inform the process. So if not user fees, then what? And so whenever we send out the survey, that's the type of feedback we'd like to see you incorporated into this recommendation. Because ultimately the state's going to have to answer the funding questions on our behalf as well. And so what is the state going to implement? How are they going to implement it? Is it going to be some of this carbon pricing and trading market? And, so there's going to be some state solutions that are implemented that are beyond our control, but also we need to look to locally, what do we want to sustain for ourselves? And this is, initially this is the feedback that we're getting to date, but we'd like to incorporate what you're saying within the comments and the feedback.
Well, my big problem is that you want to tax people, and it looks like every time I read something, they want to tax the property tax, severance tax.
Right, so.
There's a very few people that pay that tax, and there's a hell of a bunch of people that don't pay no tax that get benefit from it.
Right, so again, I'm posing the question to you all, if not property tax, if not user fees, then what?
Well,
And that's what I'm challenging people to think
well, we're
through
sitting here, we're
critically.
paying a property tax for our drainage boards. We're paying property tax for mosquito control, all this kind of stuff for their own property.
Yeah, and the
So
reality
everybody
is,
benefits from it.
the reality is that the development is happening outside of your parish, but the water is coming to your parish.
Well,
And so.
That's the exact thing, we in the bottom of the watershed here.
Right, exactly.
Everyone above us is, like, we're doing the same thing here. We're trying to take care of drainage. And the whole watershed is trying to do that.
Right,
But we happen to be in the bottom.
right.
Now, how is this initiative going to try and make sure that these drainage issues up in the upper watershed don't cause more problems in the lower watershed?
And that's where there's some sort of oversight by a collaborative committee that would be recommended to be put in place. And so we walked through it today, but APC is essentially being recommended as the agency to help facilitate the coordination on behalf of those parishes. But the composition of the parishes is going to be the governing authority and or body. And so, where else is this being done? Florida has a water management districts that have been set up since the 70s that have been coordinating water management for, on behalf of their parishes. And so it's a very similar model that has been functioning for Florida, and they have way more water than we do. I mean, they're more coastal than we are in Louisiana. And so, but the big thing for us is like we drain almost the entire Mississippi River Basin that's going out of, through Louisiana. So we need to become experts with our waters to understand how we live with it, how we better plan for it, and then utilize the assets that we have. I think one of the biggest messages that I got from Stephen Pico's presentation on, he's with Adaptive Strategies. He's a consultant that was hired by the state to really critically look through all of the potential funding solutions. And so the biggest biggest message that I got from that is that we have so much water, and water has always been, you know, you use it for rice farming, and we use it for crawfish, and, you know, we also use it in our navigable waterways, and we also utilize it for the oil and gas industry. And so it needs to be an asset of ours, and we need to position it to where we're considering it as an asset. And I mean, there's other areas in nationally that are, you know, that lack water. They go through droughts. And so, you know, we need, his recommendation to us is looking at water as a commodity. And so do we make that mental shift now? Is it eventually going to happen? But what I'll tell you is that some of the conversations naturally is, you know, limiting the amount of disaster funds that we received after a disaster cycle. And then some of the other conversations that we've heard from, you know, congressional representatives, we happened to be a meeting in, I think it was maybe Acadia Parish or Evangeline Parish, one of the two up there, where a representative was presenting, how about we just move everybody north of I-10? And those are some of the conversations that are happening in Congress. And that's just not, it's not viable. It's not feasible. Does it make sense? But if that's the case, if we're being subsidized at the federal level and they're talking about cutting subsidies, or they're talking about other alternatives, you know, we need to critically think, how do we plan better for the water that we are working, that we have in Louisiana? And so how do we become more resilient? And that's another, I mean, I could talk forever about this, but I really wanted to hear what you guys had to say. So
The thing that really is disheartening, you know, we all drove over here and we looked at how much it rained today.
Yeah.
The worst thing for me is that all that water is going straight out Bear Canal and all that, and we can't capture that. You know, we want it. I want to keep it on my farm. I don't want it to leave.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, do some incentivizing producers to have some sort of way to capture it, put it on the ground. Yeah. You know, since we do already have the infrastructure for that, is something that would help. You know, in my opinion, and then allows us to reuse it. You know,
right.
You know, rice fields are very big filter strips, and it becomes a lot cleaner.
And you know, tangentially, I've been hearing conversations where that is part of the solution. Is how do we look to our farming community to help provide those types of solutions and more nature-based and natural solutions. So
we have someone's hands raised online. I think it's Ben Longwine with Iberia Parish.
Hey Ben, can you hear us?
Good morning. I'm almost ashamed that I know how to raise my hand. It took me a long time to learn how to do that.
Ben?
You can go ahead with your question if you can hear us, Ben.
Yes. What I'm hearing, and you know, we're talking about watershed management. Can you all hear me?
Comment in the chat box. For whatever reason, we can't hear you right now.
Cannot hear me. Okay. Let me try something here.
One concern that people have been telling me about, and just not knowing very much about what LWI is all your talk is about riverine flooding. Riverine flooding will be worse if you don't address storm surge flooding. Whenever we get a southeast wind blowing, I don't give a damn what kind of structure you have down of Vermilion River. Water's not going to go out.
And I think that's why they have CPRA at the table, is to help with planning for.
I'm not going to do
however,
that.
How do you feel about CPRA?
I don't want to do
Just wait a little while.
Ben, we should be able to hear you now, I think, if you want to try again.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. I was just trying to, my volume was too low on my end. Oh, you know, when we talk about watershed management, and I think I'm echoing what I'm hearing from this group, it is that, and I'm not quite sure who made I think it was Christian, just going by voice recognition. You know, none of us who use groundwater would be using it, I mean, if we had surface water available, because it costs more water. And to penalize those of us who don't have good surface water to use for irrigation purposes by putting a fee on us makes us look like the bad guy. I think with this watershed, when you talk about financial fees to be imploded on on guys who are using groundwater for irrigation purpose that shouldn't even be on the table, because when we're talking about watershed management in this part of the world, we're talking about managing our surface water, not our groundwater. So those fees shouldn't even be considered. I don't think you're going to get any support from agriculture on that end. But that's just my take on it. There's what we should be doing with watershed management plans is creating opportunities to conserve surface water so that it's available for irrigation to those people who don't have the ability, because there's more groundwater is.
I think we lost you, Ben.
Rachel, can you talk to see if we can still hear online?
Hey, y'all, I think we did lose Ben because I can't hear him anymore either.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Rachel.
Rachel Sanderson's online. She's actually the Region 7's Watershed Coordinator. So there.
You saw some of the slides that our engineer showed. You can see the extent, and I mean, if you see what we're going through to set up this watershed, the main watershed, main parish. That's kind of planning and that kind of effort is really needed, rather than just looking at all kind of areas and trying to find some money to do certain things. You gotta first go out, determine what's the best in the watershed.
Right.
For the entire watershed. Right. So there's something in Lafayette Parish. Everything south of Lafayette Parish has to be looked at to see the positives and the negatives of that project.
Right.
Now, I haven't seen any of that kind of planning.
No, so it is in one of the very first recommendations. We talked about a watershed plan and a hazard mitigation plan. And that essentially is what we would like to see happen, is that we know that there are, issues within this part of the watershed. So what is the priority? Part of it is the state would like to implement the modeling effort and put the modeling for the entire Huck 8 so that they can understand the impacts going up and downstream. And so that modeling effort would help to inform the watershed plan in the planning process.
You got to remember that the state plan,
Yeah.
you got to realize that one size doesn't fit all.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is why it would be probably more than likely a watershed plan based on each hub.
On what?
Didn't they already pull funds from the federal government to create a modeling aspect to?
Yes.
Did they do that for each region?
Yes. So there's roughly $20 million allocated for each region to develop the watershed H&H model.
So if someone is putting in a proposal, you're running it through that model to see how that would affect everything else.
Correct.
That's happening.
That's what's being recommended.
Well, y'all mentioned something about the funding, when it's gonna come out. And I don't know, I got something the other day about, there was 15 projects already funded.
Yep.
For the
And Keely
state.
talked about that at one of the very first slides.
And
It's
one
out
of
of
them
this-
that kind of struck me is one of the $10 million for residential elevations and buyouts. When we did the Southwest Coastal Study, we went through that problem. If you don't want to sell out, or you don't want to raise your house, they all the time tell me it's voluntary. That's a bunch of hogwash.
Yeah.
I mean, what kind of neighborhood you would have if 10 people in the neighborhood say, well, yeah, we're going to sell out. But 10 of them don't want to do it.
Mhm.
What's going to happen to those people? You're going to go and flood them anyhow?
So part of the issue that we've heard is, let's take for example, there was, I believe, a home in Bastrop that was worth $100,000, but over a course of 10 years, they received nearly $400,000 in federal subsidies to buy out and or to elevate and or to allow that property to become more resilient. So when does it become economically feasible for the community to continue to subsidize that property that is just essentially at some point, is it a loss? And I understand from a personal perspective, nobody wants to lose their home, right? But from an economic perspective, when the federal government continues to subsidize that one home and the value of that home is no longer there, what is the solution?
Well, when you talk about $10 million to do that, they're looking at buying out your house and your property and demolishing that. That's a cost.
Yeah.
And it's up to $200,000 to build you a new home somewhere. That's the home. That's not buying a lot. If you move to Lafayette to get a lot, it's not gonna cost you $10,000 for a lot. It'll cost you $100,000 for a lot.
Right.
And that's on top of the 200,000, up to 200,000 they're gonna give you to build you a new house.
And so that's gonna be a process that's managed through the state at this point in time. They've awarded that project, and I'm assuming that they will manage how that is implemented.
And one of them, in Vermillion Parish, one of the locations are in Forkett Island that they want to target to build, to get people to move out.
Yeah.
The
And I don't know if
problem,
you've heard about the Îles de Jean Charles resettlement, but there's that whole initiative.
another problem we're having is a lot of times this land, this, if you want to call them retention, detention, whatever you're going to build by moving these houses out. If that is, some of that is prime farmland, we're already having trouble with urban sprawl to start with. Then you're going to take some more agricultural land out. Lafayette Parish at one time and put on that they want to buy out 300 some acres somewhere below Lafayette. Prime farmland, and to build some kind of retention pond.
Right, and that just
Well,
goes
that's
back
another
to,
urban sprawl to me.
yeah, and that goes back to how do we develop better
With
with our,
development
with the
standards.
geography that we do have.
And some of the stuff I'm reading on the recommendations is that, land use that goes back to start zoning off land. And politics is gonna play a big thing in that. It may be zone agricultural, but down the road, this next generation that inherited the land wants to sell the land. Well, they may be able to sell it and rezone it, but that takes some more land out of agriculture.
And maybe one of those solutions is ensuring that we preserve the agricultural land in
Well-
certain areas, especially if it's gonna be part of the solution of the natural retention area.
Our project in Vermillion, our Watershed project, was criticized for that money being spent in that area in order to pay, and they didn't want to spend it in the watershed. They wanted us to take that money and buy people out in this watershed that we're trying to set up. That was a big criticism that came from Lafayette Parish against, but they didn't even know anything about this watershed effort we have. So general public, you better get out there and do some education
Yeah.
efforts. It's
Well-
gonna be
Yeah, absolutely.
both good and bad, and it's gonna be extremely difficult with some individuals.
Yeah, we've gotten a few tomatoes thrown at us already.
And just,
We ran into that same thing after Rita. I was one of the ones affected, a lot of us were, from Rita and Ike and all that kind of stuff. The main thing with FEMA came around and all the government agencies came around and said, why don't you just move?
Yeah.
Look, this is where my farm's at, this is where I live, my family, everything's right here. Am I gonna sell out everything I have to go move to Lafayette? I don't, I mean, that's all that voluntary crap. But, I'm gonna get off my soapbox, I'm sorry about that.
This is a good effort, and we need this effort. And we're gonna have to get behind it. We're gonna have to find how we all can sit at the table.
Yes.
I really don't, up to this point in time, since this effort's been done, I wouldn't give a high rating as far as communicating communities and what's going on. You're gonna have to do more. And it's gonna have to be a big, big priority because this is a big, big effort. And there's so many regions in this, and so many watersheds, and so many different attitudes across the whole state.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
and this same program that Keely just went through is the same in all the other watersheds, because I was in on another watershed meeting, and it's some of the same slides and everything, so it's a state effort on a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
There's gonna be some individual parts to it.
Yeah.
But most of it's gonna be a statewide effort.
right, yeah, absolutely. It's probably, the majority of it's gonna be a statewide effort, right? Eventually, we're gonna have to go through some sort of enabling legislation. And so this is the part where we're literally beating the ground and trying to get critical feedback from people that we need. So and I can't even tell you how many meetings we've been at, but we've engaged with 16 parishes. We are going to be presenting to the American Society of Civil Engineering. So we're hitting the engineering group. We've had a legislative roundtable. And I would tell you, I would encourage you to get your legislators involved as well. It's a message that needs to be communicated to them about the priority, and then what are we advocating for as a region. We've also done presentations, so with the Vermilion Rainy Day Alliance.
Our coastal community, we're going to be engaging home builders and realtors. We have a webinar tomorrow with One Acadiana to get the business community involved. This is just the first phase, and so with 16 parishes, this is going to continue until next year. So I agree, and then we'll get more, need that input as well from the general.
This call was advertised and sent out to, I think, every soil and water conservation district in the entire state,
No, within our region,
in our region.
yes.
How many, I went on this website, Zoom, I saw 3 participants.
Yep.
And I'm one of them because I logged on. So other than the people in this room, this whole effort got 2 other people to listen into this presentation.
Right.
And I know one of the secretaries called me earlier this week, Monday, and just said, well, why should I get on the call? Is it gonna be anything important? So apparently she didn't get the right message to her of how important this would be and what she needed to communicate to her 5 board members. So we may be missing something somewhere, not exactly sure what. I don't know what that was, but it's making sure that the right message is sent to make sure that they do realize it as a priority to get on it and listen.
Is it possible to, on our Area 4 meeting, to maybe have Judy and them give a presentation?
They could. The only problem with that is that the agenda is set to a certain aspect of it as far as needing to be, and there's some people outside of our region that is not a part of our region.
Which is okay, we could engage the other region
Right.
that it does touch. So that's
What
not.
it is, you're gonna have several districts there.
Well,
So they
yeah,
could give a
but the only,
chance to.
again, it's, the agenda is set, and I'm not, we're not vice president, we normally
Okay.
strongly set for updates, not something like this to come in and do, so.
And honestly, that's where we could use your assistance, is, we're out there trying to get in the right meetings, to get the right conversations going with the right people. So we just encourage you to let us know what else needs to be done. We have meetings with LMA, the Police Jury Association. I mean, we have a lot of meetings coming up, but
Because
wherever we can make it work, we would like to.
Because Area 4 consists of just about all the coastal part of the state.
I know the state is going to be doing a recording. We'll also record this presentation so it can maybe be circulated via email.
And the other regional coordinators, we do have community calls with the state, among the coordinators, all 8 of us. And they were going to be, I gave them the tools. We got a call from Joey Bro, and we got information from him that he would help assist the other regions to get those contacts. So any other means, we'd appreciate that as well. For the soil and water conservation districts.
It's going to be continuing is more as an LACD level. That way it touches all, and it's not specific to just our region, to get everybody on board, coordinating that through, like you said, through Joey, through Office of Solid Water. Caitlin is here. That's something Caitlin can help with, working with the Office of Solid Water, but her living in Region 5, I think she would be a good communication with that and touching base with all the districts.
And I'm just trying to get more districts, at least get a glimpse of what's going on with them, and maybe get them more involved.
We appreciate that.
Well, if there's no other further comments, questions, or feedback, I just want to thank you all for taking the, allowing us to present today, and we're open to recommunicating the message to whoever needs to hear it. So feel free to stay in contact with us. We do have a newsletter that does go out and a sign up via email, so we can add your names to the list as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. You did good. You did good.
Oh, Mr. Benson has
You did
his
good.
comment says, sorry, I lost you all for a minute. We should not be using groundwater usage as a method as for long-term funding. A better way would be to develop surface use. Watershed management in this part of the country is more about flooding than groundwater use. This group supports voluntary approach to conservation. Thank you, Deb.
Thanks, Kate.
And thanks to our online people. We're gonna end the meeting now.